Okay, I'm just going to let the rest of the people who are waiting in the waiting room to join in, and we'll begin the presentation shortly. Can everyone hear me? Yep, great, thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening. Okay, all right, I'm going to begin speaking, and I'm going to go through some meeting logistics first this evening. So we're asking folks if you could please include a name for your Zoom, identify yourself, and to keep your camera off and your microphone muted. And the chat will be disabled this evening except for asking the moderator a question or logistical or technical concerns that you might be having. Every attempt is going to be made to answer all questions, and duplicate questions will not be asked. And we've allotted this evening 20 minutes for question and answers. And just so everyone knows who's on the call this evening, that this is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the Hollis-Brookline Community Conversations Facebook page, and a link will be provided through the HB News online website. And lastly, we're going to spend a couple minutes at the end of the presentation because we're trying to gauge interest. If you are interested in attending future open dialogue events by Zoom for open dialogue to discuss topics and diversity, equity, and inclusion in our community or on a larger scale, we invite you to join our Facebook group, Hollis-Brookline Community Conversations. And events will also be published to the Hollis-Brookline News online website, or you can email me directly if you do not participate in Facebook and you want to get that information at stjohnmichelle@gmail.com, and we'll add you to a future distribution list. So I just wanted to briefly go through tonight's agenda. We are doing the welcome and Zoom logistics right now, and I will be introducing our panelists this evening. And Tiffany Testa will start us off at once we are just done with this introductions, and then Karen McCormack will be joining us next at 7:15, and then Dr. Marie Ramos will be following up with a final conversation at 7:25, and then we'll be, hopefully everything will stay on schedule and we'll be able to open it up for questions and answers. And we hope to wrap everything up and have a quick input about that next event at 7:55. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. Karen McCormack is a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and co-coordinator for journalism studies at Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. Her research examines the role of information and communication technologies in shaping access to opportunity and strategies of survival. She teaches classes in data analysis, research design, organizations, and race. Our next panelist is Tiffany Testa. And Tiffany has been working in progressive education for over 20 years. She teaches science and math at the Parker Charter Essential School in Devens, Massachusetts, and works with teachers and schools to implement innovative change in curriculum, assessment, instruction, and school culture. She's been a strong advocate for understanding diverse learners, focusing on social aspects of learning, building relationships with students, and supporting student voice. Ms. Testa holds a master's in education and teacher instructional coaching, and she will be discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, or as known as DEI, as it relates to work in education, touching on the connection to social and emotional aspects of learning, and will make clear the distinction between DEI work in education and ideological arguments on race and racism. She will also consider the impacts on school districts when the two are confused. And finally, we have Dr. Marie Elizabeth Ramos. She's a family physician activist in both rural and urban settings, and she is also the medical director for the Gatehouse Treatment Center. She is an advocate for high quality, affordable healthcare for all, and focuses on empowering patients to achieve their best health by helping to break down barriers to optimal wellness for communities. Dr. Ramos will review the timeline for the development of the SAU 41 DEI committee and how the document came to fruition. She will also discuss the science on the effects of COVID-19 on social emotional learning, also known as SEL, resilience of students as we re-enter the school year. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn over the conversation to Karen McCormack. But before I do that, I just want to say that at any time in the discussion, you can add your questions to the chat, which will come directly to me. And so we'll have a record of all of those questions coming in. So thank you.
You're on mute, Karen. You're on mute, Karen.
Thanks. I thought we were starting with you, Tiffany. Yes?
I thought we were too. Why don't I go ahead?
That sounds good.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It truly is an honor to have everyone come together around this important subject. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Tiffany Testa. I'm a member of the Hollis community. I have two sons, 13 and 15, that go to the middle and high school. And I've been working in education for over 20 years now. I'm a teacher, a math and science teacher. I also work with schools and teachers and all sorts of things regarding education, assessment, curriculum. And so tonight I will be discussing DEI and education and what that is, and sort of making a clear distinction between that and race ideologies. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started. So I'd like to start with the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion work in education. DEI and social and emotional learning are foundational to understanding how learners learn. And so doing this work in schools, it's constant work, it's evolving work. As we learn more about how students learn, there's more to be known. And so doing the work is keeping updated in best practice and skill in order to better address the needs of all learners. So having a sophisticated and up-to-date understanding of diverse learners, how they learn, and the implications that has for teaching in the classroom, and then developing the skills in order to implement that in effective ways in the classroom so that we can meet the needs of all students, and also to build a culture of mutual respect so that all students can learn. In this work, we use essential questions to drive the work. And so we ask ourselves questions and we reflect on those questions. And in doing so, we come up with skills and ways of addressing learning most effectively. And over on the left, I have a large list of those questions, but on the right, I've highlighted a few that I think are pertinent to what we're talking about. So the first, what are the skills needed in order to engage students effectively in difficult conversations that provide equal student voice and are void of teacher bias? So the role of the teacher is not to impart our knowledge and our ideas and our beliefs, but to create situations and experiences where students' voices can be heard, all student voices, all student ideas, where they not only are able to voice their ideas, but they're active listeners and participants in the conversation. And that takes skill and understanding about learners. And in doing so, students are able to construct their own knowledge and not be passed on the ideas of the teacher. How can we develop and grow our instructional skills to engage learners in experiences that allow them to grapple with ideas and construct their own learning versus being filled with understanding and beliefs that are the teachers. And this plays out in lots of different ways in the classroom. But one of the things that is really true about schools is many classrooms tend to be liberal environments. And one of the things that we've seen over the year is, along with what's going on the outside world, our schools aren't buffered from that. And so the things that adults are thinking about and discussing are the same things that students are grappling with. And in order to create environments where all voices can be learned, it's really important that our teachers are empowered with knowledge and skills in doing that. And that it isn't about what their beliefs are, but it's about creating environments that are conducive to having these conversations. How do we create a school culture of mutual respect, inclusion, and a tone of decency and trust? That has to do not only with students and student relationships, but also the adults in the building. How are the adults in the building modeling that? How is it seen not only in the classrooms, but in the halls and in all parts of the curriculum? And then how do we ensure every student sees themselves in their own learning and that their learning experiences reflect their own lived experiences? One of the big things that's known in how learners learn is that we construct understanding by making connections in our lives. And so we start with our own experiences and then we connect and build and scaffold on that. And so in order for all learners to learn, they need to see themselves and engage and connect with their learning. So one of the things that's going on not only in our community, but in many communities at the state level and at the national level is that there is a huge debate and talk and arguing over ideologies of race and racism. And what happens is diversity, equity, and inclusion in education, all of those things that I just mentioned, somehow gets wrapped up in that. So it becomes diversity, equity, and inclusion in education and ideological arguments on race and racism and what I want to do is make a distinction between the two because they are distinct things. So it's not DEI in education and or in these ideological races. They are two distinct things. And so here you see two columns. And what you see is at the top, it says, there is a clear distinction between DEI work in education and ideologies on race and racism. And so on the left, diversity, equity, inclusion are listed, not everything, but many, many of the aspects that are included in this work. And I'm going to highlight a few. So the first is it's not just about race and sex. And in fact, I like to say that 15 years ago, we didn't have LGBTQ learners. We didn't have bisexual learners. We didn't have Black and brown learners. We didn't have learners with anxiety. We didn't have, and obviously that's not true. The truth is we had them and they were in the classroom, but our understanding of them and our awareness and address of it, it wasn't that way. You taught one type of student. And now the more we know about how students learn and diverse learners, we recognize all the identities which define a person. And DEI work is about addressing those diverse needs so that all students have access to learning. Understanding the value of focusing on building student relationships, that's part of DEI and SEL work. Understanding teacher bias and the effects in the classroom. This probably is one of the biggest areas of DEI work that is very, very important. It is not our job as educators to impart our knowledge and beliefs on students. In fact, I always say my role, and when I'm doing my job well, students may not know my beliefs at all because I'm there to foster an environment for them to express their ideas, for me to expose them to what's out there and the ideas and for them to grapple with it. And then the act of knowing students well. So that's DEI work. Over on the right are ideologies on race and racism. And I've highlighted two that have come up in our community. It's been this idea of Martin Luther King or critical race theory. What will we have? But what I want you to see is this clear distinction between the two. Ideologies on race and racism are just that. An ideology is a belief of how the world is and how the world should be, based in social sciences. And there are lots of ideologies on race and racism, and over time they build on themselves like any learning builds on itself. And so our town has said Martin Luther King or critical race theory. And what I want to make distinct is that those arguments on which ideology or which idea, that's the other way of thinking about it, they are ideas. And that argument is which idea can we accept? And as we know, diversity, equity, inclusion is about all ideas. So what happens when a community is not able to acknowledge that distinction? What happens to our students? Well, one of the things that happens is that we start to equate this type of work that I just showed you that is essential to meeting the needs of all students, to creating and fostering respectful, mutually respectful environments, situations in which we have skilled and knowledgeable teachers that can allow all voices to be heard and void of the teacher bias. We start to equate that with a theory. And in our town, what's really risen has been the ideology of critical race theory. And we as a nation have become heightened on that because of books that have been sent out. But what's happened is we've equated DEI work with one ideology. And that's simply not true because they are distinct. But when you equate it and then you push back on that ideology, what you're doing is you're pushing back on the essential work that's needed in order to make it so that one ideology doesn't dominate in the classroom and so that all views are brought in. The other thing that happens when we engage again and again and again in the dialogue and in the argumentation of critical race theory is that we deflect and divert all of the focus and attention on what's really the needed work, which is establishing DEI growth and understanding in the schools to better serve our needs. So we divert all of our focus on all of these things that are mentioned and have to do with DEI work. So I leave you with this idea here that the point is not for us adults in our community to argue or decide or try to control which ideas are allowed in our school, because schools are places for all ideas. But instead, I ask that we support and insist that the district-wide learning and growth empowers teachers and leaders with knowledge and skills so that we support DEI work, and in doing so can effectively create learning environments and a school culture of mutual respect where students are exposed to all these views and supported to construct their own learning and their own meaning, to use their voices and to make claims and back them with evidence. Thank you. And I will stop sharing now. And I want to now introduce Karen.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thanks everyone for having me. I'm going to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what doing this work looks like inside the classroom. I've been teaching in the college classroom for about 20 years, and I've had a lot of experience doing work on encouraging my students to do a whole host of things in the classroom. But it's a lot of work to ensure that that space is an inclusive space and that our students feel empowered by the work that they're doing there. So I'm going to share my screen and use a couple of slides as I talk about this. Essentially, we're looking at what diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts look like in a classroom. And I think a lot of what I've experienced inside a college classroom, they're somewhat different from what you would see in a middle school and high school environment, but there are many of the same efforts because we have many of the same questions, and they reflect some of the questions that Tiffany began with in her presentation. I wanted to start though by just defining what these terms mean, because we're throwing them around in all sorts of ways in the debate that's happening in Hollis, and I think sometimes misusing or at least talking past each other because we're not using them in the same way. So recognizing diversity as just a way of respecting and valuing differences and different perspectives on a whole host of identity characteristics and other dimensions, including political affiliation. When we think of equity, we're really thinking of leveraging the strengths and needs of all of our students and ensuring that we're meeting their needs so that they have opportunities to learn. And when we think about inclusion, we're often thinking about creating environments where everyone is welcomed, where different perspectives are heard, and where students can feel a sense of belonging. Because if they don't feel that sense of belonging, it's very difficult. All the education research suggests it's very difficult for them to truly engage in challenging work, whether that challenging work is in calculus and biology, or if it's in history and social sciences. So this work goes across all of the disciplines because it is an important sort of precursor to student learning and an important condition in which students can learn. I want to talk really briefly about two kind of locations of this work. One is around the context of student learning, so how we create that inclusive and accessible learning environment for students. And the second is the content of learning, what content we engage with, how that represents and reflects the diversity of people's lived experiences across the globe. And I'm going to argue that both of these are really important, but you can't have one without the other in certain ways. So the first is around this context, and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are often used to broaden students' access to learning, creating opportunities for all students to learn. One of the ways that happens is through accessible spaces and materials. So for example, when we share PDFs with students, ensuring that they're accessible for a student who might be using a screen reader. When we have students buy materials, this is more of an issue perhaps in a college classroom, but certainly true when we're talking about middle and high schoolers, when they might be trying to run out and buy that sort of, tri-board or poster board the night before a presentation is due. And not all students have equal access to someone to drive them around, for example. And even things like slide design. You'll notice in my slides tonight that there's never any color or anything else behind the words, because there are things that we can do in the design of even things like our PowerPoint presentations that make them easier to see for students who have visual impairments. Accommodation for learning differences is a second of these categories, and I don't mean to suggest that these categories are exhaustive. We could come up with a much larger list than this. But for example, things like typing responses when students struggle with handwriting, or in giving students time, extra time for tests, because we want to make sure through the whole process of learning that what we're measuring is student learning and not some other arbitrary, characteristic of something that's happening in the environment in which they're learning. And then social and emotional challenges. And I can speak to the fact that as a classroom teacher, it's really easy to look at a student who's maybe yawning and falling asleep in class and assume that they don't care about learning, assume that maybe, they're just not interested or they don't like you. And it's really easy to create uncomfortable situations between teachers and students. But working with a respect for students and kind of a positive attitude, I guess, we can invite those students into conversation. I had a student one time who was falling asleep in class really quiet, and I thought she really dislikes this class until I realized that she was working night shifts and coming to school for a 3-hour class after being at work all night long. And she was actually a tremendously excellent student, but having had the conversation, I could then reach her and we could make accommodations for that. It's really important to recognize that many accommodations help all of our students. So for example, we make wheelchair accessible bathroom stalls, but those bathroom stalls make it easier for the student who injures themselves on the sports field, who needs to use the bathroom and needs that extra space, or even the parent who's going to parent-teacher night with a toddler in tow. Closed captioning, similarly, we may use closed captioning in videos for students with hearing impairment, but at the same time, they help our English language learners, and they help other students who process things visually rather than, or particularly through words, effectively. And so accommodations, and we often call it universal design and universal design for learning, these accommodations are oftentimes creating an environment that helps all of our students rather than just the students who have some kind of diagnosed need for the accommodation. When we think about context, we also think about creating a culture of engagement, a welcoming and inclusive classroom environment and school environment. So the role of teachers here is really central, and it goes far beyond policies around bullying or kind of stopping bad behavior, but in fact, it involves inviting students in very active ways. And sometimes these ways seem not that significant. They seem like relatively small things, but they matter a lot. So for example, learning and pronouncing students' names correctly, even if that really takes work, but ensuring that students are seen and heard in the classroom. Recognizing the strengths of more introverted students. It doesn't mean we don't want to encourage them to use their voice to be heard, but recognizing that they have other ways of contributing to class discussion, hearing them, recognizing where they are strong, and then using that as a tool to help invite them into the conversation. Similarly, identifying student strengths. I've had students, for example, who may struggle with writing complex ideas, but making a podcast, they can do it brilliantly. And as soon as you recognize those student strengths, you can help them develop the skills that they may not be as strong in. I think oftentimes this is sort of misrecognized as a sense of kind of letting students not develop those skills, kind of work around the issue. But in fact, it's a way into helping them build the skills that they need rather than a way of letting them kind of not have to do that. When we talk about families, for example, making sure our students know that all types of families are valued and that their families are families that can be talked about in the classroom. And even really tiny things, like you'll notice on my Zoom name, I have pronouns there. Without saying anything about it, that signals to students that I want to identify them in the way they want to be identified. It tells them that I am listening and that I hear them, which is not to say that I don't make lots of mistakes around these things. Only that we make efforts and we listen to students and try to accommodate and make the environment more and more welcoming as we can. And then content. It's just a quote on this slide you can read, but we often use the analogy of windows and mirrors to think about what's going on in the classroom. It connects with what Tiffany said about students starting where they are and building out from their own experience. Students need to have mirrors in the curriculum where they can see their own experience. That may be things like in a science or math classroom to have girls see examples of scientific discovery made by women so that they can see themselves and see their own possibility in the curriculum. But we also need, I like this part of the quote, the fresh air of windows, right, into the experience of others. We need to prepare our students to recognize the diversity of experiences in the world around them. We do those things because there are a whole host of skills that we want our students to have. So for example, it's not about teaching a student what to think about a particular issue. In my classes in sociology, we talk about lots of controversial issues. It's not about convincing them of my point of view, but I don't just want them to disagree or have opinions. I want them to have informed opinions. And to do that, they need to be able to parse information, to look for the validity and reliability of any point of view that they see. They need to have critical thinking skills. They need to be able to think for themselves, to make ethical decisions, to engage in respectful discussion and debate. We know that employers really want them to be able to work in diverse teams. This is actually a key thing that if you look at the studies of employers that they say they need, and we need them to be able to work with data. All of these can come from inclusive class discussions where students can question one another, where they can bring different ideas to the table, and where those ideas don't just sit there as sort of all kind of equally valid, but in fact, where we're asking them to use evidence to develop stronger ideas. Sometimes it strengthens their position, sometimes they challenge their position, But it's only in those moments of real curiosity and growth and openness, which can only happen in a welcoming and inclusive space, that we really see the opportunity for growth. And I think at the heart of all of this is just recognizing that our students are smart people. They are curious people. They want a space to engage with the things that they care about, and we can do that with them. And I think we can listen to them and get better at doing it as we go. So those are the ways that I see this happening in my own classroom, and it makes for a really interesting, robust experience. I look forward to walking into those classrooms all the time and to engaging with the young people who are coming into the class ready to learn. So thank you for letting me share that experience. I am going to turn things over to Dr. Marie Ramos.
Thank you so much, Karen and Tiffany, and thank you all for being here and listening to the conversation. I realize we are a little bit behind, and so I'm going to get right to some of the slides that I have to share. So I am charged to give context to this complicated web that we weave called the DEI document and committee that we've experienced as a community over the last 9 months now. Just for context, how did this come about? I'm a doctor, but more importantly, I'm a wife and a mother of 3 here in Hollis. I grew up in New Hampshire, and after getting our degrees and living life outside of New Hampshire, we decided to come back to build our roots here. And as with everyone in the summer of 2020, we were all shocked. We were all experiencing a pandemic. Our kids were uprooted from routine and from a sense of normalcy. And on top of that, just growing and increasing polarization around them. And my kids, and I'm sure many other students in the community, they were not immune to those changes, whether exposed directly to the world around them and to the news. They could sense that something was not correct. And inevitably, in the summer, June of 2020, my kids, my 13-year-old, then 12, and my 9-year-old at the time, they asked me, Mom, why isn't the school saying anything about these horrible things that are happening around the country? And what does that mean about how the school cares about us as students here? That just got my heart. And as any good parent does, I sought out to find a way to help address that question, because if one group of kids are asking these questions, and probably more kids are asking the same questions. And in my work as a physician, I have to take my patients in their social context. I can't do a good job being a doctor without that understanding, and neither can I for my kids. And so June, July of 2020, our school board was presented with what they call, and is labeled on the website as, the Community Resolution Against Racism. And I was one of those authors. I do a lot of work with the Academy of Family Physicians, doing policy work and development, help to craft and design diversity, equity, and inclusion departments on a national level. So I said, well, if at the very least, can our school district just make a statement understanding that some of the kids are struggling with these changing times. And of course, not knowing the context, and although I had great intentions as a mom, as a community member, and as a citizen, sometimes our intentions don't necessarily correlate with the level of impact. And what did happen though was an engagement of discussion. And having grown up in New Hampshire, I will say that this is the most discussion that I've seen openly from community members and engagement on controversial issues than I ever experienced growing up. But what was most striking is that the school district decided to make this DEI committee, not necessarily because of a few adults in the community, you know, speaking out. It was really because a group of students, high school students and others, approached their superiors, their administrators, and shared the same concerns. What is the community and what is the school going to do to help us as students make sense and create a community that is open and welcoming? And that's really what started this DEI committee. And it was a committee that was brought together from various experiences around the issue of DEI, or the subject of DEI. And what it became initially was a shared space where we as a group decided that we're going to put down some walls and have level of transparency. And the first couple of meetings in September and October were just that, or maybe it was 2 in October. But it was really just getting to know one another and sharing personal stories. What does DEI mean? And what we came to find out is that the words that I use in my context, as with my hat as a physician and my lived experiences, they have very different meanings for other people with other shared experiences. Who would have thought, right? And understanding that these words also come with a lot of baggage from outside of our community. And one thing I appreciate most about New Hampshire is that we are a state that is made of many small micro communities. And what we decided around that table, the majority of us, was that, you know, we're going to decide and define what does equity, what does diversity, and what does inclusion mean for us in Hollis and Brookline. And that is the beginning of the process. In November, one of our members on the committee did divulge the right to know law, and that allowed us to, that gave opportunity for us to hold public forums. And I think, you know, what that did was that opened up an opportunity for the town to have honest conversation, to put in their input, their recommendations, their concerns, and possibilities of alternative language in the document. And what it did, I really think, is that it made it richer. It made the document more reflective of what's foundational and what is the bridge, what is the foundational concept. And what I grew to learn over this last 9 months is that really at the end of the day, the folks in our community, we really want the same thing. We want our kids to have the freedom to share, to learn, to ask questions without feeling coerced. And that's why we decided to put this image within our document. And I put the link on the page here. We came to understand that equity for the community members in Hollis and Brookline, we came to understand that equity means the same thing. It is not equality of outcomes. It's equality of access to learning. And learning is defined in different ways based on, as my colleague said, based on experiences, and that varies. And so equality means that everyone gets the same thing. Everyone learns the same curriculum, the same way, but not everyone will experience a positive experience as a result of that. But equity means that everyone will have an opportunity to experience a quality education and an opportunity to have a level of inclusivity and community, but that may look different. And of course, any kind of images, they have their limitations. But we wanted to again address both in a prose sense and also in an image sense, what we're trying to get at as a community specific to us. But why talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion now? We are in a pandemic. Why bring this up and cause even more stress on our community? And the reason is because COVID is impacting many aspects of equity. And as a matter of fact, my pediatric colleagues, they created a whole planning and considerations for returning to in-person school because this collective trauma of the pandemic alone has caused such a shift, not only for students and families, but also for educators and staff, that we need to have a deliberate approach on how we're going to create a milieu where people can not only now have a learning environment, but also have an opportunity where, oh, somebody's not muted. Sonia, thanks. So have an opportunity to also reconcile this last year's experience. And so the COVID impact is actually going to affect our kids, not only from a developmental standpoint, but also how are we going to help our kids who are scholastically achieving well, but yet now we have other kids who may not be scholastically at a level of competency that they need to be. How are we going to meet all those kids' needs when they come back? And how are we going to equip, more importantly, our staff and our have been working tirelessly to get things right for our community. So we talked a lot about various aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I'd like to leave us with is that we are many sides and opinions of around DEI. Out of all of that, we're all saying the same thing in the sense that we want to cultivate and nurture an environment where our kids can grow and thrive as they emerge out of this last year's experience. And we recognize that we can have really great seeds like we do here in Hollis-Brookline. We are one of the best school districts in the state. But if we don't create intentionally an environment that can help our seeds get rooted and water them and create a milieu where it can thrive and grow and flourish, and more importantly, be able to share and spread more interest and more understanding and more learning and collaboration, then how are we going to be preparing our future leaders? And so I leave you with that if we can strip away all of the noise from outside of our community and do what we're really good at here in Hollis-Brookline, look at what really matters and create an accountability process between us as community members and our school system, we can grow a beautiful garden. I'm going to stop sharing here, and I want to thank everybody for this opportunity, and I will turn the mic back to Michelle.
Yep. Thanks, Tiffany and Karen and Marie. I really appreciate your time this evening. And we do have some questions in the chat, and I just would like to remind folks that you can type your question directly into the chat, and we're going to respond to them in the order that they come in. So the first question to the panel is, are you familiar with the work of Dr. Kathy O'Neill with respect to bias in systems, particularly public institutions? And if so, what bearing does this work have on DEI? Is there someone from the panel that would like to take that question?
Karen, do you or I can take it too. I am not familiar with that name, but I am familiar with the idea of bias in the classroom. And basically all that means is that we all come with our own experiences and our own ideas. And as teachers, our job is not to impart those ideas and beliefs, but to create environments that let the ideas and beliefs of the students rise up, be heard, and go through that sort of analysis and critical thinking of those ideas, as Karen had mentioned in what she had spoken about.
And I think, I'm just looking up the name now because I didn't recognize the name, but I believe if you're talking about the Kathy O'Neill who wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction, I have read her work. And certainly I think she talks a lot about sort of inclusion in the classroom, but also around algorithmic inequalities, right? The ways that algorithms, even though they are embedding human bias, even though we don't see it because they're not doing it as the face of humans. But I think she provides some interesting, I can't recall exactly her specific arguments, but I mean, she's definitely talking about the ways that in areas and disciplines where we often don't think about questions of bias as much as we do in the humanities and social sciences, that in fact, those biases, they infect and impact the work, in medicine and healthcare and technology and all of these other areas as well. And becoming aware of them and sort of being able to articulate what those are can be really powerful ways and first steps of addressing and creating more, again, inclusive technologies and other sorts of products that are the result of a lot of this work.
One of the examples I often use in math education that I've seen time and time again is this internal bias that sometimes comes. I see it in parent conferences where you have the parent there and you have the student there, and maybe the student is struggling with math, and the parent says, well, I was never good at that either. We're not good at that. And I sit there and I've heard it many times. Well, we don't like math and we're not good at math. And that sort of messaging, there's actually research in it. Joe Bowler, who writes Mathematical Mindsets, talks about the messaging that students get repeatedly again and again and again in all sorts of areas, and the effect that that has on their own ability to engage in the learning, to believe in themselves as learners, as mathematical learners. So I'm very aware of those things in my own classroom.
Great. Well, thank you, Tiffany and Karen, for answering that question. So the next question I have is, and again, this is directed to anyone on the panel that would like to respond. Wouldn't credible, and credible here is some quotes, wouldn't credible sources be subjective? You can take virtually any source and find truths and lies within the source itself. What one person finds credible, another may not. That was the question.
I'd love to speak to that. I do a unit. I do a unit in math, in logic, and I actually work in an interdisciplinary classroom, so it's math and science, and it gets at a beautiful unit on what is truth in math versus what is truth in science. And we get to explore the idea of inductive versus deductive reasoning, and we get to talk about science. And we actually get to have students argue that science never gives us truth. And because, only until it's been affirmed that it cannot be unproven is it, a law. And so I think that is absolutely true in every source. In everything that we do, we come with perspective.
I think I would challenge that just a little bit, Tiffany, if we can model some good, healthy debate here. Sure. I think that to some extent that's true, right? Because science is always improving. We are always open to new questions, open to new data. But on the other hand, we make all sorts of decisions because we trust the science, right? Because we trust some ways of knowing over others. I teach courses on statistics and data analysis. One of the most popular books in that field is How to Lie with Statistics, right? And students come in and say, but you can make any argument. And I say, yes, you can, but some arguments are better arguments than others because they use the data more responsibly. They put things into a more holistic context. They are open to debate and open to question. And so, yes, we can find various answers in the data that we want, but if we're honest with ourselves and honest with our students, then we can find better answers. They aren't ultimate truth answers because we know, right? Like science, the beauty of science, whether that's social science or physical sciences, is that they keep improving, that they're open to, to additional kind of verification, validation, a replication, and that we continue to look for better answers. But I think that's a very different answer than we can find any truth we want, because we can, but not if we're being totally honest with ourselves and really rigorous with the kind of work, research, empirical evidence that we're using.
Yeah, and I think there's a balance that needs to be had within the school setting. We have a responsibility, at least I do in my office, in my examining room, to help my patients have informed decision making. And the hard thing about informed decision making is that depending on the sources in which they get their information, it may seem very valid to my patients, but we do have evidence-based practices and best practices when it comes to, again, the foundational and important things that we find are important as a community. There are various modes of interpretation. And one thing that this process of communication has shown me is that our sources can be very vetted in different ways. And so if we are firmly believing in the validity of our sources, there needs to also be a level of pliability when trying to understand the perspective and lived experience of somebody else. And that's a balance. There is evidence-based practices and vetted sources, best practices with the best known resources that we have, yes, but there is also the individual experience and what is valued by the individual. And I think, where we're finding ourselves a lot of times is in that intersection, especially when we are in a place of educator, whether that be in the examining room or in the classroom. And so I think the more seminal question for me would be, how do we balance and how do we engage our students as a community within the classroom setting? How do we engage?
Marie, are you not able to unmute?
Oh, I'm all done. I'm sorry. Did I freeze?
I wasn't sure what was going on.
Got 5 more minutes, so I just want to make sure we give
let's move on to another question. I wanted to connect, but
sorry about that. That was a little bit of a technical glitch there. So Marie, if you had any more to add, you can. We do have a few more questions in the chat. So folks, if we'd like to stay a couple more minutes, but I'd like to be able to ask, let's see. The first one that I'd like to ask is, do we know what Superintendent Corey's recommendation is as to what the SAU 41 should adopt? He said he was not ready to support either the community DEI proposal nor the proposed amendment. What is the school board recommending?
If I knew, I think that's the $1 million question, right? I think we're still in a process here, and certainly, I don't know if this is the right venue for us to make assumptions about the decisions of the district or the school board.
Sure.
So I would defer to them. I do recognize, though, that as community members, we have a tremendous opportunity here to find, again, common ground, to collaborate, and to maybe clarify what is the foundational ask of our school district. And I think that if we can do that in a meaningful way, then it might help our school boards in our district make a clearer decision one way or another, or maybe an alternative.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to, I have a couple other questions, and I think it's going to be one of those things where whether or not someone can answer this, but the next one is.
Michelle, I do want to add, I did get some information on that. I do know that the Hollis School Board had made a recommendation, and I believe it's in the minutes. They met, it's Thursday, they met last night, so it's in the minutes.
Mm-hmm. I believe, yeah, there was a chat. The co-op board voted unanimously against recommending Article 15, and I can copy and paste this into the chat in a second, but let me just start the next question so we can at least get that, try to get that addressed. So
yes, I want to correct myself. It was not the Hollis board, because the warrant article is not for the Hollis board, it's for the co-op.
It's the co-op, yes, correct. All right, so this person asked, my son, a recent HBHS grad, has been talking about this topic with his peers who are under the impression that the Jim Crow laws would be skipped in future curricula. He's a history major and feels strongly this should not be omitted. Can you verify if this is true or hearsay? I think we have to pass on this question. Is that correct?
The thing is, we're hesitant to speak. I mean, you would have to reach out to Hollis-Brookline High School.
Yep, I agree with that.
I'm not familiar with the history curriculum.
Yeah. So there is, let me just, so someone asked a question directly to Dr. Ramos. Can Dr. Ramos provide some clarification on what she means by the district needing an accountability process? What type of process does she envision?
Oh, well, I don't envision any process, you know, specifically, but what the recommendation is from our medical societies, both on a national and a local level, is that as we're re-entering in-person school, we have to recognize that this cataclysmic change in the way of life, the way that we have interacted with one another, is going to also change our level of interaction and possibly how we identify scholarly aptitude as well, because of the effects due to COVID. So we have just a growing amount of evidence as far as that is concerned. And then also the fatigue that our professional caretakers, like teachers, staff, medical staff as well, who are essential workers, the level of fatigue that has ensued as a result of COVID in trying to address the needs of the people that they serve. So what I mean personally by an accountability process is that our school district, our school boards, they are essentially elected officials, and they value our word as community members. And so creating an opportunity to engage actively with our schools so that we can figure out what is the, you know, what is the best plan for our kids in the school system. That might be different than how we've approached things before. And I would want to hope that the DEI committee was a beginning step to that, trying to figure out what does a Cavalier look like for our community members? What are the qualities of a Cavalier? So I hope that's a little bit clearer. I would love to hear from, you know, from our educators to see if there are other best practices. But in essence, let's collaborate and let's let's be in a place where we can work together with our school district in a more jointed, it's my medical terms, in a more unified fashion.
I think I've mentioned this many times before. It's the idea of bringing all of our voices together, knowing that every student voice is what this is about, and bringing all of the diverse voices together to support asking our boards, asking our administration, and asking our schools to begin this work and to really dive deep into this work in thinking about and questioning and carefully considering the ways to address all students' needs and create culture that allows for these types of conversations and this type of learning to happen.
Okay, we have one additional question that's kind of a multi-question ask in here, and I'd like to be able to ask that, but I also want to just say it is 8 o'clock, and before I ask this last question and before we might lose anyone, I just wanted to remind folks that this was an event that we hosted as a panel with a Q&A, but we would like to be able to open the opportunity for open dialogue with folks. And before I go to that last question, I was going to ask Karen McCormack, are you ready to talk a little bit about what you're envisioning those next steps might look like?
Sure, and I'm not sure that these are all the next steps, but I guess I would like to offer, if people really want to dig into some of these topics, sort of read and think together in a dialogue, right? Part of what we can best do for our students is to model respectful discussion and discourse for them and the process of learning, that I would be happy to facilitate some of those. So I guess maybe reaching out, either like sending a direct message, or I think, Michelle, you've shared your email address in various places, so you could pass names on to me too. But if anybody has interest in doing something like that, I mean, those are discussions that I facilitate frequently, right? And it might be a way that I could bring some of that to maybe help in this conversation a little bit. I don't think it's the only part of the conversation that people want to have, but I would be happy to do that if there are people that are interested in digging in a little deeper.
And so this next question that we received is sort of a multi-part. It starts with a statement and then it goes to a question. So it says, there continues to be confusion, deliberate or not, over the difference between equality versus equity. What the panelists are describing, and this is in the words of the questioner, is equality of opportunity. Why can't we adopt equality instead of equity? Equality means all get the same opportunity, all get the same opportunities to do with what they will. Equity means taking from one to give to another to achieve the same outcome. Words mean things, and we should be concise in what we are trying to do.
I can address that. Equity in education does not mean taking from one and giving to the other. The resources that are allowed in education are there for all students. Equity in education means meeting the needs of every student so that they can access learning. And so a lot of focus is not only that the learning is there, but that the student has what they need in order to access the learning. Another way we say that is engage in the learning. And so considering all of the facets of each individual learner, which connects us to the idea of knowing our students well. That's a big theme in best practice in education. When you connect with a student on all levels, when you know about their lived experience, when you know about their social and emotional, all of these things come together to profile that student as a learner. And then you're able to meet the needs so that they can access education. It does not mean equal outcome, because as educators, we know that as diverse as every student is, so is where their experience takes them and where they end up. Karen, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think that was exactly what I would have said too, Tiffany. Thanks.
And there was go ahead.
Just really
Sorry,
quickly.
Marie.
No problem. The only additional thing I would add to that is, at least from the DEI committee experience, part of the reason equity and equality were differentiated is because not everyone has the same definition in the community of both. And so we wanted to be deliberate on how we defined it as a community so that we could all speak the same language. There are those with different perspectives, and equality does not necessarily mean what the author of the question said. And so that's the premise of having a heart of collaboration so that we can make sure that everyone feels heard and also that we're speaking and saying the same thing as a community.
Tiffany, the person who asked the question that you had talked about, the mathematical response, they wanted to get the name of the author again. If you could provide that.
Yes, in fact, maybe I could even, oh, I can't put it in the chat, can I? Jo Boaler, Joboaler, out of Stanford University, and 2 books. Many books she's written. She's done tons and tons of research. You can go, it's called ucubed.com. And the book that I'm referring to is called Mathematical Mindsets. And it has all to do with the math classroom. And it discusses not only the way that we send messaging to our students, but it discusses equity in the math classroom. It covers all sorts of areas from tracking to collaborative learning. She also has lots of other books that are geared more towards elementary. This is a high school level book.
I'm just adding that to the chat, so hold on one second so people can have access to that. Thanks. The next question was a follow-up to that. So, well, not a follow-up, but it was a part of that initial question. And Marie, this was directed to you. I think this person was quoting something that you said earlier in your conversation, and it said, horrible things happening around the country. Any examples in HB?
I don't feel privileged to speak the experiences of other people. What I can say, though, is that at least on record, there was a group of students that felt that there were several incidents in their experiences coming through the tutelage within the school district that did feel it was strong enough for them, even, you know, in their last years as HB students, to bring this up to, you know, to their administrators. So apparently in our community, yes, there have been incidents enough to, you know, to spark concern.
I could jump in on that, and the word horrible is inflammatory, and I suppose that word is also individual. You know, what it might be horrible to one might not be horrible to the other. But I do want to bring up an example that shows sort of what this is about. Last year, there was a transgression, let's say, in school culture. And what happened was swastikas were found in the bathroom. And that was brought to all families' notice in a letter. And what it said, it was a letter saying, you know, we are not immune to this. It came from the principal. We are not immune to this. No community is immune to this. But it's an opportunity for work and for growth. And the opportunities start with conversations, and that students would engage in those conversations. And that didn't happen on a sort of school-wide level. And it may be that it happened in individual places, but that's the work of social and emotional learning and diversity and equity inclusion, where we create those structures and we give teachers those skills and understanding in order, when those types of things happen in a community, they are a great opportunity to engage in what it means to be a part of the community and what is mutual respect. And so that's the type of work that DEI and SEL are associated with.
Well, I fear that we are running out of time, but I would like to ask, there is one question left I could ask this evening. Otherwise, we could wrap it up. Is everyone open for one last question? Okay, great. It says, what is the fear from the other side about DEI? Do we have a sense of where this stems? And does anyone want to try to talk about that question?
I'm not going to, again, I don't feel I have the privilege to know if it's fear. But what I can say is this: I have tried to engage individuals and families in conversations in this work. And what I have heard from some families that have identified as having conservative views and their students have conservative views is that what they find is that those views are not supported in the classroom. And I think oftentimes when we feel as though when you feel like you've lost control, you want control. You know, I know personally for myself, I don't like to feel out of control. And when I feel as though I'm not being valued and my views aren't being valued, then I have to somehow control the environment. And one way to try to control the environment is to control what views are even allowed in the school. And so I think that that's really, that can be a place of where trust can build. And I've seen that in education and over the years, that when communities don't trust, then that can happen. And the idea is to build trust, to engage in growth, to empower our schools, to create these environments where all voices can be heard.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Tiffany said. I think that through the engagement that we've had in the DEI committee, what I've grown to appreciate is that we're all, well, I can't generalize too much, but there are commonalities in the concerns for those who may have more conservative leanings. It's not that they don't think that that everyone deserves a voice or everyone should have the freedom to share and express, but it's the concern of being forced to comply. And I would venture to also say that perhaps our more left-leaning folks in town also have a deep concern of having to comply to maybe different ways of thinking or tracking our students from an academic standpoint, or labeling. It's varied. What we all really want, and what I am embracing more and more, is that we want to have equal value of our opinions and respect of our opinions by those who are in the classroom. We recognize that the classroom is a dynamic, that students are in a very in a fragile position, that if they're not in an environment that is nurturing and welcoming, then it's very hard for them to assume their voice, whatever that may be. And as a parent, first and foremost, and as a content expert in my field, that is really what my goal is to help create a mutually respectful environment that that is able to help our students or our communities have balanced and understanding approaches to when we communicate with one another. What we do with that information, that is back on us and back on our families. So I hope that answered the question to an extent.
I know we're running out of time and people are still putting questions into the chat, but here's one question that came up earlier in the chat. If anyone could just indulge this person and respond to the question, that would be most appreciated. It says, can each panelist briefly describe their military experience serving this country?
I have no experience in the military serving the country, but I was honored once as a teacher to fly at a Pease Air Force Base in one of those gas refillers. And that was amazing, amazing. But one thing that I do know that I have in common is that I am a servant of many, many. I have had thousands of students come before me, thousands in the 25 years, which is kind of sad because we get a lot in a year. But I always see myself as a servant, and I am there for one purpose only. I am there to serve every single student that comes before me. I don't get to choose who I get. They just come there with their beautiful selves, and it is my job to make those connections and help that student access learning. So I do see myself as a server of our nation, but I have not served in the military, though I do have family members that have and do now. Karen?
I haven't served in the military. I certainly, in jobs that I've had before this, where I've had a lot more non-traditional age students, I've certainly taught many returning soldiers, returning enlisted folks, and I have had students go on to military careers, but I have not personally served.
I have not served personally. I have family, my brother being one, who did serve, and I have served in community health center settings, and was a recipient of the National Health Service Corps scholarship, which did require a level of service in that way, but not personally. I haven't had that privilege and honor.
Has to, I know Dr. Ramos has to leave this. She's on a time, and she's already given us another additional 20 minutes of her time this evening. But there was one person, and I'm not going to be accepting any new comments, but there was one person who felt that I didn't read their question, and it's a three-part question. So you know, I would like to be able to read that through, and if people have time to just digest it and respond or add any additional based on what was initially asked. So this person started off by saying, there continues to be confusion, deliberate or not, over the difference between equality versus equity. What the panelists are describing is equality of opportunity. Why can't we adopt equality instead of equity? Equality means all get the same opportunities to do with what they will. Equity means taking from one to give to another to achieve the same outcome. This person goes on to say, words mean things, and we should be concise in what we are trying to do. The second part of that was Tiffany nailed it in that teachers should teach how to think, now what to think. Oh, I think it's supposed to be not what to think. Yes. If they do not, they have failed as teachers. Tiffany describes equality, not equity. And last, the full thing to Marie was Marie, horrible things happened around the country. That was the quote. Any examples in HB? Her timeline directly equates racism with DEI. Why? So I know that was a lot of information, but to be fair to the person posing that question, and I was trying to abbreviate in time, but they were sensitive to that. And so if folks could just spend a couple minutes addressing that, and that will be the final question of the evening. So I thank you all.
I would like to start, I think it was the first point about equality. This is really important in education, because what happened in education for a very long time is, as I said, and I wasn't joking as in to be snarky, but about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we all taught the same student, even though we didn't have the same student, right? And as we learn about learners, but the reason that equity is used in education is because equality, equal, if you give everyone the equal tools to access learning, not every kid can access the learning. They need different tools. So equity is about different tools to access the learning. Here's a really great example. I give performance-based instruction. It's very open-ended. And for some students, I literally give them the project page and they fly with it. And for other students, it's really good for me to break it down and to chunk it and to help them. And then I have probably 3 students that don't need the steps chunked, but they need some support in breaking down their timeline. And so those are all different tools that they're using, and accessing different tools and having those different ways of then being able to learn. So equity has to do with providing access, but realizing it's going to take so many different ways of supporting their needs. And that's why it takes a lot of knowledge and skill and constant growth and learning for teachers, constantly continuing to work off of what we know about how learners learn. So that was part 1. I don't know if Karen, you want to add to that, but the other part of that. Yes.
I can just address the direct question. So first of all, thank you for pointing out that subjective and emotional moment. I am a mom and I am human, and to see my kids struggling with really hard questions, that was horrible. And that's where that came from. How we define that, that's different for everyone. So I thank you for showing grace in that transparent moment. But as it relates to the development of, and I would say evolution of the document itself, you are absolutely correct. My initial involvement and call to action was directly in response to the questions that my children had. That was a mother's attempt to try to understand and to try to ask the school a way to respond, and understanding as well that that wasn't a singular experience, that there have been other racially motivated or ethnically motivated incidences that probably could have been approached in this environment of dialogue and understanding. And so, yes, originally that was the beginning concept. But what I hope that our listeners can understand is that, as with history, as with learning and transparent dialogue, and the ability to listen and consider alternatives, I personally realized through the work with the DEI committee that although we may have good intentions, our impact can be very different depending on who is in the receiving end. And my intentions were not to overthrow and dismantle and have an agenda. My agenda was you know, kids need to be seen. And what I recognize is that, hey, you know, there are many facets of what that means in this community. And who am I as an individual to narrow that conversation? And through the process of talking with other individuals in the community, we recognize that, yeah, equity, equality, you know, diversity, those things have meaning, and we have the opportunity to better define that for us as a community. And so that the concept of the document is a reflection of that process of dialogue, collaboration, and mutual respectful learning from one another. I hope that is made a little bit more transparent.
And with that, I think we're going to conclude our panel, and we look forward to having more opportunities to engage the community and to have conversation, and not to just have a moderated Q&A, but to have an actual conversation. And so we invite you all to follow the community, the Hollis-Brookline Community Communications Facebook page, or you can email me directly at stjohnmichelle@gmail.com, and we will be sharing and posting events on the Hollis-Brookline News online as well. So thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.